Welcome. There is no need to get comfortable just yet, although you may of course adjust your pillow if you would like to. There is no rush. There never really is when we are talking about history. And tonight, we are going to talk about a very particular kind of history. The kind that happened slowly, the kind that happened over and over again, year after year, in much the same way, without very much changing at all. We are going to talk about winter. Specifically, we are going to talk about how ancient people dealt with winter, and we are going to take our time. Let us begin at the very beginning, which is to say, let us begin in autumn, because winter does not simply arrive. It comes gradually. It gives a great deal of warning. The leaves change, which ancient people noticed. The air gets cooler in the mornings, which ancient people also noticed. The days get shorter, which is perhaps the most important thing they noticed, because shorter days meant less time to do work outside, and less time to do work outside meant that there was a great deal of pressure to finish certain tasks before the cold arrived properly. One of those tasks was storing food. Storing food is not a very exciting topic. It was not a very exciting topic in ancient times either. It was simply something that needed to be done, and so people did it. They gathered things, they dried things, they salted things, they buried things in the ground where the earth would keep them cool but not frozen. At least for a while. They thought about food a great deal in autumn, more than they thought about almost anything else, because food was very important and winter was coming, and there was a limited amount of time to prepare. Let us think about grain for a moment. Grain was perhaps the most important stored food in many ancient civilizations. After the harvest, which itself was a long and tiring process, involving a great deal of bending and cutting and bundling and carrying, the grain had to be threshed, which means separating the grain kernels from the stalks and husks. This was done by beating the grain against flat stones, or by having animals walk over it repeatedly on a flat threshing floor. This was not quick work. It was repetitive work, the kind of work where you do the same motion again and again and again until your arms are tired, and the pile in front of you looks only slightly smaller than when you started. Then the grain had to be winnowed, which means tossing it into the air so that the wind could blow away the light chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. This required a slight breeze, which did not always come exactly when it was needed, and so people would sometimes wait. They would stand there, holding their winnowing baskets, waiting for a suitable wind, and then the wind would come, and they would toss the grain upward and watch it fall, and do it again, many times, until it was clean enough. Then the grain had to be stored. It was put into large clay jars or wooden bins or pits dug into the ground and lined with straw or clay to keep out moisture. The storage area had to be dry because wet grain would rot, and rotted grain was not useful to anyone. It also had to be protected from mice and rats, who also found grain very appealing, and who did not have any concept of winter preparation or fairness, or the fact that this grain belonged to someone else. People in ancient times spent a surprising amount of time thinking about mice, not in a philosophical way, simply in a practical way. Where were the mice getting in? How could the holes be blocked? Had the cat been doing its job? Was the grain beginning to smell odd, which would indicate that something had been at it? These were the thoughts of autumn, slowly giving way to the thoughts of early winter. Now, let us talk about the cold itself. Ancient buildings were not, for the most part, particularly warm. The idea of insulation as we understand it today, material specifically designed to trap heat inside a structure, was not really something most ancient peoples had access to. What they had was thick walls. Stone holds heat reasonably well, which is to say that it is slow to warm up but also slow to cool down, and so a thick stone building would stay somewhat warmer than the outside air, at least for a while. Mud brick behaved similarly. Wood was less good at holding heat, but was better at blocking wind if it was fitted properly, and fitting wood properly was a skill that took time to develop. The main source of heat in most ancient homes was fire. Fire is a straightforward thing when you have it. It is warm, it produces light, it can be used for cooking, it requires fuel. The fuel situation was important. In many parts of the ancient world, wood was the primary fuel, and wood had to be gathered and stacked and dried before it would burn well. Green wood, meaning freshly cut wood that still contained a great deal of moisture, would burn poorly and produce a great deal of smoke, which was unpleasant in an enclosed space. Dry wood burned much better, so people gathered wood in summer and early autumn and stacked it somewhere sheltered, and over time it dried out, and then it was ready to burn in winter. The stacking of wood was itself a task. It required some thought about how to stack the wood so that air could circulate and help it dry, while also keeping rain off the top of the pile. Different cultures developed different approaches to wood stacking. Some people made neat, precise piles. Other people made somewhat less neat piles that still functioned adequately. The wood dried either way, more or less. Firewood had to be carried. This was also a task. Not an interesting task. Simply a task that had to be done, involving carrying armfuls of wood from the stack to the fire. In cold weather, this meant going outside, which was unpleasant, and picking up pieces of wood, which required bending and carrying, then back inside, which required walking, multiple times per day, every day of winter. The fire had to be kept going overnight, which was a matter of some concern. Letting a fire go out was not catastrophic. Fire could be restarted, but restarting it was a nuisance, and in very cold weather, a house without fire became cold rather quickly. So fires were often banked at night, which means covering them with ash to slow their burning, so that they would still have coals in the morning, which could then be blown back into flame without having to start entirely from scratch. Blowing on coals in the morning was a familiar experience for most people who lived through winters in ancient times. You crouched down and you blew carefully, not too hard, and you watched for the orange glow to strengthen, and you added small pieces of dry kindling and waited. This is what mornings were like. Let us now discuss clothing. Ancient winter clothing was primarily concerned with warmth because the other concerns, fashion, appearance, expressing one's personality through textile choices, were very much secondary to the fundamental problem of not being cold. Wool was the most widely available warm fibre in many parts of the ancient world. It has properties that make it well suited to cold weather. It traps air between its fibres, which provides insulation. It can hold a fair amount of moisture without feeling immediately wet against the skin, which is useful when you're doing outdoor work and generating sweat. and it was available, because sheep were available, and sheep produced wool regularly without requiring much encouragement. Preparing wool for use as clothing was a lengthy process. First, the sheep had to be shorn, which happened in spring, and the fleece had to be cleaned, which involved washing it and removing debris and lanolin, the natural grease that wool contains. Then the wool had to be carded, which means combing it so that the fibres all ran in roughly the same direction. This was done with 2 flat paddles covered in short metal teeth, and you put some wool on one paddle and dragged the other paddle across it, and the fibres straightened out, and you did this many times until the wool was a soft, cloud-like mass ready for spinning. Spinning turned the loose wool fibres into thread or yarn. This was done with a spindle, which is a weighted stick that you drop and let spin freely while feeding fibre onto it in a controlled way. The twist of the spinning spindle caused the fibres to twist around each other, making a continuous thread. This was skilled work, but it was also repetitive work, and in ancient times it was done constantly, while sitting, while walking, while talking to other people, because the hands could learn to spin without requiring a great deal of conscious attention, and so spinning became a background activity that accompanied everything else. Thread became cloth through weaving, which was done on looms and which also took considerable time. The simplest pieces of woven cloth, rectangles, were then shaped into garments, or draped and pinned without shaping, depending on the culture and the period. More elaborate garments required cutting and sewing. Sewing in ancient times was done with needles made of bone or metal and thread, and it was fine, careful work, especially by firelight, where the needle was sometimes hard to see. People in winter sat near fires and sewed and mended clothing. They mended things that had worn thin. They added patches. They repaired straps and fastenings. There was always something that needed mending because clothing wore out through use, and you could not simply go and buy new clothing. You made it, or you wore what you had, or you went cold. Let us move now to food preparation in winter, which is a topic of similar gentle detail. Winter food in ancient times was simpler than summer food, because fresh ingredients were not available. The garden was frozen or bare. The animals that provided meat were sometimes slaughtered before winter, because it was difficult to feed them through the cold months and they would lose weight anyway, so it was sometimes more practical to kill them in autumn when they were at their heaviest and preserve the meat. Salting was one method of preservation. Smoking was another. Drying worked for some meats. Fermenting worked for others. Preserved meat had a particular texture and flavour that was quite different from fresh meat. It was often quite salty, because salt was the primary preservative, and before eating it, you might need to soak it in water to draw some of the salt back out. This was another small winter task, soaking the salt meat, changing the water, soaking it again, tasting it to see if it was still too salty, perhaps soaking it once more. Beans and lentils and dried peas were important winter foods. They stored well if kept dry, and they provided protein, and they could be cooked into thick soups and porridges that were warming and filling. The cooking of bean soup was not a quick process. Dried legumes require a long time to become soft, and so a pot of bean soup might sit over a low fire for many hours, needing only occasional stirring. This was perhaps one of the more pleasant forms of winter work. sitting near the fire, stirring a pot of soup every so often, watching it gradually thicken. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets, and similar things could be stored in cool cellars or underground pits and lasted a reasonable time through winter. They were boiled or roasted and eaten alongside the preserved meats and the bean soups. They were not especially exciting as foods go. A boiled turnip is a boiled turnip, but they were nourishing and available, and in deep winter those qualities were more important than novelty. Bread was eaten wherever grain was cultivated and stored, and making bread was a daily or near-daily task. The grain had to be ground into flour, which was done by hand using a quern. 2 circular stones, one placed on top of the other, with grain fed through a hole in the top stone and ground fine as the upper stone was turned. This was hard, repetitive work that left flour on everything, and produced a steady grinding sound that was probably very familiar to anyone who lived in such a household. The flour was mixed with water, and sometimes a leavening agent. Sourdough starter was used in many cultures, and kneaded and shaped and baked. Baking was done in clay ovens, or on heated stones near the fire, or in ceramic pots placed in the coals. The bread that resulted was dense and filling. It had a thick crust. It was not especially soft by modern standards, but it was warm when it came out of the oven, and warm bread is a pleasant thing, and in winter pleasant things were appreciated. Now, let us talk about animals. Many ancient peoples kept animals through the winter, or tried to. Livestock represented considerable value and could not simply be abandoned when cold arrived. Sheep and goats and cattle and pigs and horses and donkeys, depending on the culture and the region, all needed to be housed somewhere warmer than the open field, fed through the months when grass was unavailable, and kept healthy enough to survive until spring. Winter animal care was daily work, twice daily work. The animals needed water, which froze in very cold weather, requiring ice to be broken from troughs, or fresh water to be hauled from a source that had not frozen. They needed feed, hay mostly, which had been cut and dried in summer and stored in large quantities specifically for this purpose. Calculating how much hay to put up was an important autumn task, because running out of hay in January with 2 months of winter still to come was a serious problem. Better to have too much than too little, but too much was expensive in labour, and so the calculation was always somewhat anxious. The animals lived through winter in a state of reduced activity. They stood in their stalls, they ate their hay, they drank their water, they generated warmth, which was useful in a shared space, because the heat of animal bodies could make a barn or byre considerably warmer than the outside air. This was so well understood that in some cultures, people and animals shared the same building during the coldest months, separated only by a low wall or a wooden partition, each warming the other through simple proximity. The smell was presumably distinctive. The animals had to be checked regularly for signs of illness, because a sick animal in winter could die before spring, and that represented a significant loss. An experienced farmer knew the signs: a lack of appetite, a dullness in the eye, a reluctance to stand, a cough, and took them seriously. Remedies were available, ranging from the practical to the herbal to the traditional, and people applied them with varying degrees of success. Mucking out the stalls was another regular task. Animals produce manure continuously, and the manure had to be removed or it would pile up and become unsanitary and damp and generally unpleasant. So it was shoveled and carried out and added to a heap, somewhere away from the main structures, where it would spend winter slowly composting into the fertilizer that would be useful come spring planting. This was not particularly glamorous work. It smelled, and it was heavy, and it had to be done whether or not you were tired or the weather was unpleasant. It was done. Let us now spend some time considering ice and snow. In regions where winter brought significant snowfall, the snow itself became an organizing feature of daily life. It had to be cleared from certain areas, the path to the water source, the path to the woodpile, the area around the door, or those paths became impassable. Clearing snow was done with various implements, wooden shovels, shaped, boards, brooms made of bundled twigs. The work had a simple quality. You pushed the snow moved, you pushed more snow. Eventually the path was clear. Then it snowed again. In very deep winters, buildings could be partially buried by drifting snow, which actually provided a form of insulation. The snow around the lower walls helped to keep heat in the same way that an igloo made of snow can be surprisingly warm inside. People in snow-heavy regions often became aware of this effect, and did not necessarily remove all snow from the vicinity of their buildings. They cleared enough to function and left the rest. Ice was useful. In regions near ponds or rivers, ice could be cut in large blocks during the coldest months and stored in ice houses, underground pits or well-insulated sheds, where it would remain frozen well into summer, providing a form of cold storage. This practice was widespread in various parts of the ancient world and was taken quite seriously as a form of food preservation technology. The cutting of ice was its own seasonal task with its own tools and techniques. Longsaws were used to cut through ice of considerable thickness. The blocks were heavy. They were slid across the surface of the pond or river on sleds, or carried and stacked in the ice house with layers of sawdust or straw between them to slow melting. Ice from a frozen pond in January could be sitting in an ice house in July, still providing cold. There is something patient about that. Let us turn now to what people actually did with their time during winter, once the essential tasks were managed. In agricultural societies, winter was traditionally a quieter time. The frantic pace of planting and growing and harvesting was over. There was less to do outside, especially in bad weather. This meant there was more time for indoor activities, and people made use of it in various ways. Tool maintenance was one. Winter was a good time to repair broken tools and make new ones. A cracked handle on a hoe needed to be replaced before planting season. A scythe blade that had become dull through harvest use could be resharpened at leisure in winter. Leather harnesses for animals needed cleaning and oiling, or they would dry out and crack. Wooden implements needed checking for rot or damage. None of this was exciting work. It was methodical work. You looked at the tool, you identified what needed to be done, you did it. You set it aside and picked up the next thing. Craft work was another winter occupation. Pottery, where people made pottery, was done indoors and could continue through winter. Basket weaving was a similar indoor craft. Flexible plant material, soaked until pliable, woven into useful containers. The making of rope and cordage from plant fibres, the carving of wooden objects. All of these things could be done sitting by a fire, requiring nothing but the materials and the knowledge and the patience to work slowly. Children in ancient winters learned things. They watched adults work and gradually learned the skills: how to spin, how to weave, how to mend, how to care for animals, how to recognize plants, how to do all the countless things that a person needed to know in order to survive and contribute to their household. This education happened without any formal structure, mostly. It happened through watching and helping and gradually taking on more responsibility. A child of 6 might card wool. A child of 10 might spin thread. A child of 14 might weave simple cloth. The skills accumulated over many winters. Stories were told. This is not a small thing. In the long winter evenings, with the fire burning and the work of the day done or slowed, people talked. They told stories to each other, not written stories. Most people in most of the ancient world did not have access to writing, and even those who did might not use it for casual evening entertainment. They told spoken stories, stories of things that had happened, or things that people said had happened, or things that could have happened, or things that definitely had not happened but were entertaining to imagine. These stories changed as they were told. Each teller added something or left something out. And over generations the stories became something slightly different from what they had been. They carried information about how to behave, about what the world was like, about why things were the way they were. They were also simply entertaining, in the way that a good story is entertaining, even when nothing very dramatic happens in it. Many of the myths and legends that we know from ancient cultures were winter stories, told by firelight, in exactly the way we have just described. Winter nights were long. This sounds obvious, but it is worth sitting with for a moment. In northern regions at the winter solstice, the night can be 15 or 16 hours long. That is a very long time to be awake in the dark. Artificial light, candles, oil lamps, torches, the fire itself helped, but it was dim and expensive in terms of fuel, and so many people went to sleep earlier than modern people do, and woke up during the night and then went back to sleep again. This was called biphasic sleep, and some historians and researchers believe it was the natural pattern of human rest before artificial lighting made it possible to stay up late easily. During the waking period in the middle of the night, people might get up and check the fire, or visit the outhouse if necessary, or simply lie awake and think. Sometimes they talked to the person sleeping beside them, if that person was also awake. Sometimes they just lay there and watched the darkness or the dim coals of the fire and thought whatever they happened to be thinking, and then gradually fell back into sleep. Sleep was important in winter. The body needed warmth and rest. Cold is tiring in a fundamental biological way. People who had spent their day doing outdoor work in cold weather slept heavily and needed a great deal of recovery. They often slept in their clothes or close to other people for warmth. Sleeping arrangements in ancient households were rarely private. Entire families shared sleeping spaces, and the shared body warmth was not incidental. It was one of the ways people survived winter nights. Bedding was made of whatever was available. Dried grass or straw served as mattresses and were replaced when they became too damp or dirty. Wool blankets and animal skins provided covering. A person sleeping under a thick wool blanket on a straw mattress, close to another person, near a fire banked for the night, could be quite warm even when the outside temperature was well below freezing. This was the ordinary experience of a winter night in ancient times. Let us consider water in winter, because water is fundamental, and winter makes it complicated. Water freezes. This is a basic fact that ancient people were intimately familiar with. A water jar left outside overnight in hard frost would be frozen solid in the morning. A stream that had provided reliable water all summer might be ice-covered in January. Wells could freeze or become very difficult to access. This was not a minor inconvenience. Water was needed for drinking, for cooking, for the animals, for basic hygiene. Getting water in winter required more effort than getting water in other seasons. Where rivers and streams remained unfrozen, or only partially frozen, water could be gathered from them. Where wells were the primary source, ice has to be broken each morning, or water drawn before it froze. Where snow was available, it could be melted for water, although a large volume of snow produces only a small volume of water, and so melting snow was a surprisingly labour-intensive way to obtain drinking water. A large pot of snow, when melted, might produce only a fraction of its original volume in water. The carrying of water was another daily task. Large ceramic or wooden vessels were filled and carried back to the house. This was done by women in most ancient cultures, though not all. The vessels were heavy when full. The path might be icy. The cold made your hands numb on the handles. You carried the water. You put it inside where it would not freeze again immediately. You used it carefully, because getting more required the same process. Hygiene in winter was different from hygiene in warmer months. Bathing, as we understand it, the full immersion in warm water, was available to some ancient peoples some of the time, particularly those with access to bathhouses like the Romans, or natural hot springs, or cultures with sauna traditions like various northern European peoples. But for many ancient people, in many parts of the world, a full bath in winter was a rare event, if it happened at all. More common was the kind of washing that could be done with a small amount of water, hands, face, the essentials, while staying mostly clothed. This sounds uncomfortable by modern standards, but it was simply normal by the standards of the time. People smelled differently. That was accepted. The cold weather also slowed the bacterial processes that produce unpleasant odours in warm weather, and spending less time in vigorous outdoor work reduced the amount of sweat produced. It was, in a practical sense, manageable. Let us now talk about illness. Winter brought illness. It did in ancient times just as it does today, because of the same basic factors. People spending more time indoors in close proximity, the stress that cold places on the body, the reduced availability of certain nutrients when fresh food was scarce. Respiratory illnesses were common. Coughs and fevers and congestion. Children were particularly vulnerable. Elderly people were also at higher risk. A serious illness in winter, when the body was already working hard to stay warm and the food supply was already being carefully managed, could be dangerous. Ancient medicine for winter illnesses drew on whatever knowledge and resources were available. Herbal remedies were widely used. Plants gathered in summer and dried for winter use, steeped in hot water to make teas that might soothe a cough or reduce a fever. or help a person sleep. Whether these remedies were pharmacologically effective varied greatly. Some were not. Some were effective in limited ways. Some were placebos that nonetheless provided comfort, which is its own kind of value. Being sick in a warm place was better than being sick in a cold one. A person who was ill was kept near the fire if possible. They were given warm liquids. They were encouraged to rest, which in winter they could do without the work outside demanding otherwise. The care of the sick was generally done by whoever was in the household, a mother, a grandmother, an experienced elder, drawing on whatever knowledge they had accumulated. Some winters were worse than others. A long and very cold winter that depleted food stores ahead of schedule could lead to genuine scarcity. This was called the Hungry Gap, or similar names in various cultures, the period in late winter and early spring when last year's stored food was running low, and this year's fresh food had not yet grown. People managed it in various ways. They ate less. They ate things they might not have eaten in better times. They helped neighbours where they could, knowing that neighbourly help now might be returned in a future year of their own need. Spring was anticipated. It was not taken for granted. We should spend a little time on spring, because understanding how ancient people felt about the end of winter helps us understand what winter was. The first signs of spring, the lengthening of the days, a softening in the air, the first green shoots of early plants, were deeply welcome. There is evidence across many ancient cultures of celebrations and rituals associated with the return of warmth. These celebrations had a quality of relief to them as well as joy. The difficult time was ending. The stores had lasted. The family had come through. The animals had survived. Things would now gradually get better. The work of spring began quickly. Ground that had been frozen was thawed and needed to be turned and prepared for planting. Animals that had been kept indoors through winter were let out into the beginning grass. Stored food that had lasted began to be supplemented by the first fresh things. Early greens, early roots. People were outside more in the returning light, doing the outdoor work that winter had prevented. Winter was behind them, until the next one. And the next winter came in the same way the last one had, slowly, with warning, with the shortening days and the cooling mornings, and people made their preparations again. They stored grain and dried meat and root vegetables. They stacked firewood. They mended clothing and checked their tools and ensured the animals were settled for the cold. And then the cold came and they lived through it, doing the small daily tasks, carrying water and feeding animals and stirring soup and mending things, sitting by the fire in the long evenings, telling stories. This happened for a very long time. We are going to go through some of it again, in a little more detail, because this is that kind of story. Winter preparation began in earnest in what we might call early autumn, though ancient people did not use our calendar and divided the year according to different markers. The behaviour of animals, the appearance of certain stars, the agricultural stages of the year. The beginning of preparation was not a specific date. It was a feeling and a set of observations and the accumulated wisdom of the community saying, now is the time. The grain harvest was typically complete by this point, and the grain was stored. The garden had been harvested of its last produce. The fruit trees had been picked. The wild foods that grew in forests and fields, nuts, berries, roots, had been gathered over the preceding weeks. Everything edible that could be preserved had been preserved or was in the process of being preserved. The kitchen, or whatever space served the function of a kitchen in any given ancient culture, was busy. Salt was obtained in places where it was available, by different means depending on the geography. Near the sea, salt was made by evaporating seawater in shallow ponds. Inland, it might be mined from salt deposits or obtained from brine springs. Salt was valuable. It was traded over considerable distances because of its value as a preservative. To be in possession of a good supply of salt in autumn was to be in a good position for winter. Meat was salted in layers in large containers, a layer of meat, a layer of salt, a layer of meat, a layer of salt. The salt drew moisture out of the meat and created conditions hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. The resulting product was quite salty and quite dense and kept for months. Fish was salted similarly in cultures where fish was available and eaten. The smell of fish salting operations was significant, and the process itself was somewhat messy, but the results kept people fed through winter, and that outweighed the inconvenience. Smoking meat was another preservation method. Meat hung in a smokehouse or over a fire for an extended period developed a dried surface layer and absorbed compounds from the smoke that discouraged microbial growth. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavour, quite different from fresh meat. In cultures where smoking was practiced, this flavour became simply the flavour of preserved meat, normal and expected and not considered particularly noteworthy. Dairy products presented a more complex preservation challenge because milk spoils quickly. Where it was not drunk fresh, it was converted into more stable forms. Butter was one, and butter kept considerably longer than milk, especially if it was stored carefully. Cheese was another, and a well-made hard cheese could last through winter and beyond. The making of cheese involved curdling milk, separating curds from whey, pressing the curds into a dense mass, and aging the result. Different cultures developed different methods that produced different results, from very soft fresh cheeses that needed to be eaten quickly to hard-aged cheeses that lasted months. These are all things that happened before winter arrived. Preparations, quiet, repetitive, necessary preparations. Now let us say that winter has arrived. The temperature has dropped to the point where frost forms overnight and does not fully melt during the day. The ground is hard, the garden is bare, the trees are bare, the sky is often grey. It snows perhaps, or perhaps the winter is dry and cold depending on the region. The daily routine adjusts. Rising is the first challenge because rising means leaving the warmth of the bedding and standing up in a room that has cooled through the night. The fire, if it has been banked properly, has coals. The coals are blown into life. Small pieces of kindling are placed carefully and the kindling catches and the fire begins to rebuild itself. The room will take some time to warm, and until it does, the people in it are cold. They keep their cloaks or blankets around their shoulders while they work. They stand close to the fire when possible. Water is fetched. The animal stalls are checked. The animals are fed their morning hay and given water. The morning meal is prepared. In many ancient cultures, the morning meal was simple. Leftover food from the previous evening, bread, Perhaps a porridge made from grain boiled in water. It was filling and warming, which was its primary function. Then the day's work began. In winter, the work that needed doing depended on the time of year within winter. Early winter was still a time of some busyness, finishing preservation tasks, doing any outdoor repairs that needed to happen before conditions deteriorated further, completing the cutting of firewood if the supply was not yet full. Midwinter was the quietest time. The essential tasks were the only tasks: feeding animals, fetching water, keeping the fire, preparing food. Late winter began to stir again slightly, as people started thinking about what would need to be done in spring and making preparations for it. But midwinter was quiet. The daylight hours were few. In the middle of winter in a northern location, you might have 8 or 9 hours of usable daylight, and not all of those hours would be good for outdoor work if the weather was poor. So there was a stretch of time each day that simply had to be filled indoors. People used it for the indoor crafts already described: spinning, weaving, wood carving, tool maintenance, and for the social activities available to them. They talked, they told stories, they rested. Resting without guilt is something that is less available in modern life than it was in ancient life. We have many ways to fill time, and a cultural expectation of productivity that follows us even into leisure. Ancient people in midwinter may have had a somewhat different relationship with rest. There was a recognized time in the year when outside work was impossible, and inside work was limited, and in that time resting was simply what was happening. You sat by the fire. You let your mind wander. You dozed, perhaps. This was not laziness. It was winter. Children played. Ancient children played in winter, indoors and outdoors when conditions permitted. They played games with simple materials: pebbles, sticks, cloth balls, carved wooden pieces. They played games that required only their bodies and the space around them. Winter gave them time to play that the busier seasons did not, in the same way that it gave their parents time to rest. This was perhaps one of the gifts of winter. Not a comfortable gift, not a chosen gift, but a gift nonetheless. Let us talk a little about winter and the body. The human body responds to cold in various ways that ancient people would have recognized through experience without necessarily understanding the mechanisms behind them. The body shivers, which generates heat through muscle movement. The blood vessels near the skin constrict, which reduces heat loss from the body surface. Extremities, fingers, toes, ears, nose become cold first, because the body prioritizes keeping the core warm at the expense of the extremities when cold stress is significant. Frostbite, the damage to tissue caused by freezing, was a risk in very cold conditions. Ancient people who spent time outdoors in cold weather knew to protect their extremities, to wear gloves or wrappings on their hands, to wrap their feet and wear adequate footwear, to cover their ears. Those who did not or could not because they lacked adequate clothing risk the blackening and loss of fingers or toes that frostbite at its worst produces. This was not rare. It was a real danger of severe winters. Hypothermia, the dangerous drop in core body temperature, was a more acute risk. A person who fell into icy water, or who became lost and exhausted in a snowstorm, could lose body heat faster than their metabolism could replace it, and they could die. This happened to ancient people. It was understood as a danger. The response was warmth, bringing the person to a fire, surrounding them with warm bodies, warming them gradually. Whether any particular instance of this treatment was successful depended on how far the hypothermia had progressed. The cold was simply a fact that required management, and most of the time most people managed it, because they had the knowledge and the preparation and the habits that allowed them to survive. The ones who struggled were the ones who, for whatever reason, could not maintain those defences. The very poor who could not afford adequate fuel or food, the sick or elderly who could not generate enough body heat, those caught by unexpected conditions. For the majority in most winters, survival was managed. Let us now think about a specific day, not a dramatic day, just an ordinary winter day in ancient times, somewhere in the temperate zones of the ancient world. Let us say it is deep midwinter. There is snow on the ground, though it is not snowing today. The sky is overcast but not threatening. The temperature is cold but not dangerously so. Everything is grey and white and still. The household wakes before dawn, because there is no reason to wait for dawn, and several reasons not to. The fire is rebuilt. The morning meal is prepared. The day's tasks are considered without being formally decided. They are simply known from habit and necessity. The animals need attention. The water needs fetching. Breakfast needs eating. One person goes outside to the animal shelter. They are wrapped in a wool cloak. Their breath makes clouds in the cold air. The snow crunches under their feet with a particular sound that is one of the characteristic sounds of winter. Inside the animal shelter, the animals are warm relative to the outside air, and there is a smell of hay and manure, and the slightly sweet smell of large animal bodies. The person checks the animals, all are well this morning, and adds hay to the racks and breaks the ice from the water trough and refills it. The animals eat and drink with the steady focus that animals bring to these activities. Back inside, breakfast is eaten. Bread and warm grain porridge today. Hot liquid, an herbal tea perhaps, or simply hot water. The warmth of the food and drink spreading through the body is a good feeling. The kind of ordinary good feeling that is easy to overlook, but also easy to appreciate when you're paying attention. The morning passes in indoor work. Someone spins. Someone repairs a piece of harness. Someone tends the fire and stirs the pot of stew that will be the main meal of the day. The children occupy themselves. Outside, the grey sky gradually brightens and then, around midday, begins to dim again. In the afternoon, more firewood is brought inside from the stack outside. The snow around the woodpile is frozen into a crust that cracks when you step on it. The wood itself is cold and slightly damp on the outside where it has been touched by frost, but inside the stack it is dry. Armfuls of wood are carried inside and stacked near the fire. This is brought inside one armful at a time, which means several trips. The afternoon meal is the main meal, the stew that has been cooking with bread. The stew contains preserved meat and root vegetables and dried beans and smells of cooking and warmth. It is served in ceramic bowls and eaten with spoons. It is filling. The evening comes early, because in midwinter the light is gone by. Late afternoon. The fire is the main source of light now. It casts moving shadows on the walls. Someone brings out whatever work can be done by firelight and continues. Stories are told. The conversation is unhurried and familiar, the conversation of people who have known each other a long time and are comfortable in silence as much as in speech. The fire is banked. The bedding is arranged. Sleep comes easily. That was a winter day. Now let us consider winter across different ancient cultures, because the details varied considerably, even if the broad experience was similar. In ancient Egypt, winter was mild by the standards of more northern civilizations. The Nile Valley is warm enough that snow is essentially unknown, and even in the coldest months daytime temperatures remain comfortable by northern European standards. For Egyptians, winter was not a survival challenge in the same way. The Nile flood, which deposited fertile silt on the fields, happened in late summer, and autumn and winter was a time of agricultural work in the newly enriched fields. Crops were planted in winter for harvest in spring. Winter in Egypt was a time of farming and building. The Great Pyramids and other large construction projects were often undertaken in winter, partly because the cooler temperatures made the labour of moving enormous stones somewhat less gruelling than it would have been in summer. Workers on these projects were fed and housed and managed, a logistical exercise that required considerable grain stores and organisational capacity. For Egyptians, the seasonal challenge was summer heat and the anxious waiting for the Nile flood, not the cold. But winter still had a character. Cooler evenings, shorter days, a different quality of light. The ancient Egyptians noticed these things, as people notice the seasons wherever they live. In ancient Mesopotamia, the region of modern Iraq, homeland of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria, winters were cold enough to be significant but not severe by northern European standards. The region receives rainfall primarily in winter, making it the growing season for some crops. The rivers could flood in late winter and spring from mountain snowmelt, and this flooding was both a blessing, bringing water to otherwise dry land, and a hazard. In Mesopotamia, the great concern was water management, which did not stop in winter. The extensive irrigation canal systems that allowed agriculture in the river valleys required constant maintenance, clearing silt, repairing banks, managing flow. This was work that continued through winter, organised by the administrative structures of the great city-states. The people doing this work were often peasant farmers working under various obligations to the state or to temple estates. In winter, the cities of ancient Mesopotamia continued their complex economic and social lives. Merchants conducted trade. Scribes wrote on clay tablets. The writing technology of Mesopotamia, keeping records of grain transactions and property agreements and legal cases. The great temples performed their rituals, which were timed to the calendar and continued regardless of the season. The kings held court. At the household level, winter in Mesopotamia looked broadly similar to winter elsewhere. Warm food, warm clothing, fire, stored provisions. But the specific details were shaped by the local environment and the specific culture. The foods were different. The architecture was different. The religious practices that surrounded the season were different. In ancient China, winter was a significant concern for the agricultural population, which constituted the vast majority of people. The severity of winter varied enormously across China's vast geography. Mild in the south, extreme in the north. In northern regions, winters could be long and very cold, with heavy snowfall. The storage of grain was essential, and the government maintained large grain stores that could be distributed in times of scarcity. One of the most recognizable features of Chinese winter culture was the importance of warm food and the belief in the warming properties of certain foods and ingredients. Ginger, various spices, meat-based broths. These were understood as helpful in maintaining the body's warmth during cold months. Dumplings, small packets of dough filled with meat and vegetables and boiled or steamed, were a winter food across much of northern China. Practical, because they could be made in large quantities from stored ingredients and were filling and warming. The Chinese lunar calendar included winter festivals and observances. The winter solstice, called Dongji, was an important occasion. Families gathered, special foods were prepared, and the occasion marked the turning point in winter, the moment after which the days began to lengthen again. The recognition of the solstice as a meaningful moment in time was not unique to China. It appears in many ancient cultures, because the solstice was visible to anyone paying attention to the length of days, and in winter many people were paying attention. In ancient northern Europe, in the lands that would become Scandinavia and the Germanic territories and the British Isles, winter was a central fact of existence for a significant portion of the year. Winters in these regions were long and dark and cold, and surviving them required substantial preparation and mutual support. The Norse peoples of Scandinavia developed winter culture to a high degree. The midwinter festival of Yule, celebrated around the winter solstice, involved feasting and drinking and the telling of stories, with particular emphasis on tales of the past and of the gods. The Yule log, a large piece of wood burned through the festival period, was a source of warmth and light during the darkest days. The festival served to strengthen social bonds, distribute stored food through feasting, and provide a moment of celebration in a difficult season. Norse winters also involved a great deal of indoor work. Men crafted and repaired. Women spun and wove. The products of winter craft work would be used in spring and summer. A family that was industrious through winter emerged from it better equipped than one that was not. The long evenings by the fire were also the evenings when oral literature, the sagas, the poetry, the mythological stories, was recited and preserved. Winter was, in this sense, the season of cultural transmission. The relationship between Norse people and winter was not simple hatred. Winter was harsh, but it was also home to certain qualities they valued: endurance, self-sufficiency, the ability to maintain warmth and community against the cold. The extreme winters of Scandinavia shaped a particular kind of culture, one that took a certain pride in surviving them. In ancient Greece and Rome, winters were milder than in northern Europe, but they were still noticed and responded to. The Mediterranean climate meant that winter brought rain rather than snow in most coastal areas, and the concern was with damp and cold rather than extreme cold. Still, the Greek and Roman poor could suffer considerably in winter if they lacked fuel for heating or adequate food. The Roman elite had considerably more options for winter comfort than anyone so far discussed. Wealthy Roman houses were heated by hypocausts, underfloor heating systems in which warm air from furnaces was circulated under the floors and through wall channels. To stand in a well-heated Roman room in winter was quite a different experience from standing near a hearth fire, because the heat came from below and warmed the space evenly. This system was also used in the Roman baths, which remained open and popular through winter, Roman winters included time in the baths, which were social as much as hygienic spaces, and the festivals that the Roman calendar prescribed for the winter months. The festival of Saturnalia, held in late December, involved feasting and gift-giving and a relaxation of normal social hierarchies. Masters served their slaves, at least symbolically. People gave small gifts. There was a license to celebrations that ordinary life did not permit. It was, in various ways, quite similar in function to winter festivals in other cultures, a moment of celebration and sociality in the dark time of year. For the Roman poor, winter meant different things. Tenement housing in cities was not heated. People burned what fuel they could afford in braziers. Food was obtained from the grain dole where eligible, or purchased in a city economy that continued through winter. Urban poverty in winter meant cold rooms and limited fuel and food that depended on markets rather than stored home provisions. The rural Roman poor were closer to the experience of peasants everywhere, dependent on their own stores, their own animals, their own fires. Let us now return to the purely mundane details, because we have been somewhat general, and there is value in specificity when the goal is to settle the mind into the rhythms of ancient life. A person in a midwinter day in ancient Britain, let us say, gets up in the morning in a round house. The round house is a circular building with thick wattle and daub walls, woven branches covered with a mixture of clay and straw, and a thatched roof. There is a central hearth. The fire on the hearth burns through the night and is rebuilt in the morning from its coals. The roundhouse has no chimney. The smoke rises and finds its way out through the thatch, which is thick enough to allow this while remaining weather-tight. The interior of the roundhouse is often smoky, and everything in it has a smoky smell. The thatch itself is blackened over time by smoke, but the roundhouse is warm, warmer than outside, and it is windproof and rainproof, and it is home. The people who live here include a couple, their children, and perhaps an elderly parent. They wake and tend the fire. They have stored grain and dried meat and root vegetables. They have some sheep in an adjoining small enclosure attached to the back of the roundhouse. The sheep are brought into the roundhouse in the worst weather, or kept in the enclosure in weather that is merely cold. This morning they are in the enclosure. The person checks them and adds water and a small amount of hay. The morning porridge is made. Grain that has been roughly ground is added to water in a clay pot and set over the fire. It cooks slowly, thickening, and is eaten with some dried herbs stirred in. It is warm and filling. The children eat from shared bowls. The day's work. The woman of the household has set up her loom, a simple upright loom with weighted threads hanging vertically. She weaves cloth for a new garment, passing the weft thread back and forth between the warp threads, pressing each row down against the last. This work produces a steady rhythmic sound. The man of the household is working on a broken piece of equipment, a wooden yoke for the draft animal, which has cracked along a grain line and needs to be either repaired or replaced. He is examining it, deciding. Repair is possible. He will try repair first. The children do small tasks and play in between them. The eldest helps card wool. The younger ones play near the fire with simple toys. The day passes. This is what it was like. The specific details of this scene, the roundhouse, the upright loom, the sheep, the clay pot, are particular to Iron Age Britain, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. but the broad shape of the day, the tasks and the rhythms, would have been recognizable to someone in ancient China or ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Peru. The details differ, the structures are different, the specific foods are different, the specific crafts are different. But the fundamental experience of winter, the cold, the fire, the stored food, the indoor work, the long dark evenings, the waiting for spring, this was shared. Winter was the same problem everywhere, and people were resourceful enough to solve it, each in their own way, with the materials and knowledge available to them. Let us now go even more slowly through some of these details. The fire. In most ancient cultures, fire was tended with great care, because relighting it was laborious if you did not have access to living coals from a neighbour's fire. The primary methods of starting fire from scratch were percussion, striking iron against flint to produce sparks that fell into a prepared nest of fine dry tinder, and friction, rubbing pieces of wood together in prescribed ways until friction heated the wood to the point where it produced enough heat to smoulder. Both methods required dry materials and skill and practice. Neither was effortless. The tinder used in percussion fire starting needed to be very fine and very dry. Dried fungus, particularly horsehoof fungus or amadou fungus, was excellent for this purpose and was gathered and stored specifically for it. Dried grass, fine shavings of dry wood, charred cloth, these could also work. The skill was in preparing a nest of tinder that would catch the spark and allow it to grow from a spark into a smoulder that could be blown into a small flame that could then be transferred to kindling. People who were good at starting fires were valued. In communities where fire was communal, as it was in many places, the maintenance of fire was a shared responsibility. In individual households, one person typically had the responsibility and the skill. Starting fire was usually not an emergency. The banked fire from the previous night provided coals that could be relit, but knowing how to do it from scratch was important, because coals could go out in a long cold night and then fire would need to be started. The fire burned different materials in different parts of the world. Wood was most common in forested regions. Peat, compressed ancient plant material found in boggy areas, was used in northern Europe and elsewhere where peat was available. It burns more slowly than wood and with a distinctive smell. Dried animal dung was used in regions with large herds of cattle and few trees, particularly on the great grassland plains. Dung fires burn low and slow and provide steady heat. Coal was known and used in some ancient cultures near coal deposits, though systematic coal mining is largely a modern development. Each fuel had its qualities. Wood fires burned hot and bright. Peat fires glowed steadily. Dung fires were slow and constant. All of them produced smoke. All of them required fuel. Fuel management in winter was important. If you burned too much wood too early in winter, you might run short by February. If you burned too little, the house was cold. Managing the fire meant managing the balance between warmth and supply. Very cold nights required more fuel. Milder days could get by with less. The person responsible for the fire made these small calculations continuously. The smoke inside ancient homes was managed in various ways. Openings in walls or roofs, not proper windows or chimneys necessarily, but intentional gaps, allowed some smoke to exit. The position of people within the space relative to the fire was a matter of continuous small adjustment, moving away from the smoke, finding pockets of air. The eyes of people who lived in smoky conditions were often irritated. The lungs were exposed to particulate matter. This was a health cost of ancient heating that was simply accepted. Let us now talk about the very specific texture of winter fabric. Wool cloth, hand-woven from hand-spun thread, has a particular quality that is somewhat different from modern wool fabrics. It is denser and more variable in texture, because hand spinning produces thread that varies in thickness, and twist and hand weaving at its most functional tends toward utility rather than perfect evenness. The fabric thus has a rustic, substantial quality. It is not uniformly smooth, it has character. Worn against the skin, it is warm. Some people find it itchy. This is a matter of the individual and the specific wool and the weave. A finer weave of carefully combed wool is less scratchy than a rougher weave of more roughly prepared material. In ancient times, people who could afford finer cloth wore it. Others wore what was available. Children grew up wearing what their families could produce or trade for, and they did not think of it as itchy because it was simply what cloth felt like. The weight of winter clothing was significant. A wool cloak of suitable thickness to provide real warmth in cold weather is not light. It settles on the shoulders with some heaviness. When it becomes damp, in rain, or in the damp air of winter, it becomes heavier still. People who wore such cloaks through winter days of outdoor work knew this weight intimately. It was simply part of wearing warm clothing. Footwear in ancient winters was various. Leather shoes or sandals were common in many cultures, and in cold climates they were padded or lined with wool or other insulating material. Foot wrappings, strips of cloth wound around the feet before or instead of shoes, were used. Wooden-soled shoes with leather uppers were practical in wet conditions because the wood kept the foot slightly elevated from damp ground. The Romans used iron hobnails in their shoe soles for durability, a practice that also provided some grip on ice. Cold feet were a common experience because footwear was rarely as waterproof or as insulating as modern footwear. Getting your feet wet in winter and having them stay wet for a period was an ordinary hazard. It was uncomfortable, and it increased the risk of cold-related problems if prolonged and severe, but in mild cases it was simply part of outdoor life in winter. You came inside, you removed your wet footwear, you set it near the fire to dry, and you sat with your feet near the warmth until you were comfortable again. Hands, too, were cold during outdoor work in winter. Gloves existed in various forms: wool mittens, leather gloves, wrapped cloths, but they reduced manual dexterity, which was a problem when doing work that required fine hand movements. So gloves would be worn in transit between tasks, and then removed when fine work was needed, and the hands would be cold during the fine work, and then gloves would go back on. This constant on and off management of hand covering was a small but continuous feature of winter outdoor work. Let us now think about the sound of winter. Winter has particular sounds: the creak of ice, the sound of wind in bare trees, which is different from wind in leaf-covered trees, the muffled quality of sound in heavy snowfall, where the snow absorbs noise and the world becomes quiet, the sound of firewood settling as it burns, the sound of water in a kettle or pot beginning to simmer, the sound of someone sleeping nearby, their breathing slow and regular. Ancient people heard these sounds without thinking of them as unusual or notable, because these sounds were simply winter. They were as familiar as summer sounds: the birds, the insects, the wind in the leaves, the sound of water moving freely. The sounds marked the season. They told you where you were in the year. Children who grew up in ancient times grew up with these sounds as the soundtrack of winter. They knew the difference between the sound of the fire burning steadily and the sound of a fire that needs attention. They knew the sound of wind that indicated a storm was coming versus wind that was simply cold. They knew the particular quality of silence that sometimes came in the coldest nights, when even the animals were quiet and the world outside seemed to have stopped. This sensory knowledge, the knowledge of sound and smell and texture and temperature, was part of what it meant to live through winter in ancient times. It was accumulated experience, absorbed over many winters, so that the season became known in a physical, embodied way that is somewhat different from our modern experience of reading about seasons or seeing them depicted on screens. You simply knew what winter was because you had lived it. Now let us move very slowly through the topic of sleep in winter once more, because there is more to say about it. Sleep in cold conditions has a particular quality. The body, working to maintain its temperature, remains somewhat more active during sleep in cold than in warm. This is not uncomfortable necessarily. It is simply a background physiological process. But it does mean that very cold sleeping conditions can lead to lighter sleep than warmer ones. The warmth of bedding and companions was therefore not only a comfort but a contributor to better rest. Ancient sleeping arrangements were typically communal. A family shared a sleeping space, and the shared warmth was a genuine advantage. Dogs, where dogs were kept as companions rather than purely as working animals, might also sleep near or among people, adding their body heat to the collective warmth. This was not unusual or considered undignified. It was practical. The arrangement of the sleeping space was careful. The bedding was positioned near the fire, but not so near as to be a fire hazard, a distinction that required some judgment, because the desire for warmth pulled sleeping positions toward the fire, while the risk of sparks or embers pushed them slightly away. The embers of a banked fire were safer than an open flame, but still required some respect. Waking during the night was common. The need to add fuel to the fire, or simply the natural pattern of biphasic sleep, brought people to consciousness in the middle of the night. Waking in a dark house in winter, with the fire reduced to glowing coals, with the sound of wind or silence outside, with the sound of others breathing nearby, was an ordinary experience. It was not alarming. You lay there for a while. You thought things, or nothing in particular. You eventually fell back to sleep. People who were particularly cold during the night pulled their bedding tighter around themselves. This pulling in and adjusting of bedding, seeking the warmest position, is a behavior that required no instruction. The body found what it needed and the hands responded. This small nocturnal self-care, the tightening of the blanket, the curling of the body, the tucking in, was as natural as breathing. Morning arrived and the cycle began again. We should spend a moment on the sky in winter, because the sky is important. The winter sky in ancient times was the same sky as it is today, but experienced differently. There was no light pollution, which means that in clear nights the stars were dramatically vivid. The Milky Way was visible on moonless nights as a pale arc across the sky, dense with stars. This was the ordinary sky, not a special occasion. People looked up at it and knew it well, in the way that you know something you see every clear night. Ancient peoples were attentive to the sky in ways that are related to practical concerns. The stars told you the time of year, because different constellations are visible at different seasons, and knowing which stars you could see on a winter night told you where you were in winter. The position of the moon told you the time of month. The behaviour of certain stars near the horizon at dawn or dusk could signal important agricultural moments, the appropriate times for planting or harvesting, if you knew what to look for. This sky reading was a form of knowledge that was maintained and transmitted in communities. Someone knew what the stars meant. They taught others. The knowledge was practical as well as mythological, because the same constellations that featured in stories about gods and heroes also marked the seasons and helped orient people in time. In winter, the nights were long enough to observe a great deal of sky. If you woke in the night and went outside, which happened to use the outhouse, to check on an animal simply because you were awake, the sky above was immense and quiet and full of light. The cold air was sharp and clear, and the stars were close, seeming in a way that the warm, hazy air of summer nights did not produce. These moments, standing in the cold night looking up, were brief, because the cold was uncomfortable and the warmth inside was better. But they were part of winter too. The short days of winter were also noticed in terms of the quality of light available. Winter light in northern regions has a low angle throughout the day, producing long shadows and a particular golden quality even at midday that summer light does not have. This light is beautiful in its way, though ancient people may not have spent much time in aesthetic appreciation of it. They were busy with practical concerns, but they would have noticed it in the way that you notice what surrounds you when you live in close relationship with the natural world. Sunrise in winter, when it finally came after the long dark night, was genuinely welcome. The light returning, the sky turning from black to deep blue to the pink and orange of the horizon, the shapes of bare trees becoming visible, the world returning to sight. This was a daily version of the larger welcome that spring would bring, small returns of light each morning through the winter months. We have been talking for a while now, and that is appropriate for a story of this kind. Let us continue. Food in winter had a sameness that summer food did not have. In summer, the garden provided variety. Different vegetables coming into season at different times, fresh herbs, fruits. In winter, you ate what had been stored, and what had been stored was a finite list of things: dried beans, dried grain, preserved meat, root vegetables, dried fruit, where that had been prepared, perhaps cheese, if the dairy animals had been producing enough earlier in the year. This sameness was not necessarily unpleasant, because these foods were prepared in various ways and because hunger is a reliable source. But by deep winter, people were sometimes tired of their limited pantry. They craved fresh food. They craved green things. They craved variety, and there was nothing to do about it except wait for spring. In some cultures, fermented foods provided variety and important nutrients in winter. Fermented vegetables, sauerkraut in Germanic and Slavic cultures, kimchi-like preparations in East Asia, various brined vegetables in the Mediterranean, could be made in autumn when fresh vegetables are available and consumed through winter. Fermentation both preserved the vegetables and changed their flavour and texture, providing something different from raw or simply dried food. The sour, complex flavours of fermented foods also stimulated the appetite in ways that plainer food did not. Fermented drinks, beer and wine and mead and similar things, were important in many ancient winter cultures, both for their caloric content and their social function. A warm drink of ale by the fire was a comfort. Sharing drink was a social act. The production of fermented drinks was itself a winter occupation in some cases. Brewing could be done indoors, and the products were ready to drink after a period of fermentation, providing both something to do and something to drink. Spices and flavourings made preserved food more interesting, and people valued them highly. Salt was essential. Dried herbs added flavour to soups and stews. Where trade networks allowed access to exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, in cultures that participated in long-distance trade, these were genuinely precious commodities used sparingly to make food more interesting. The desire to obtain spices was one of the economic drivers of ancient trade, and some of that desire was simply the desire to make winter food less monotonous. Now let us talk very quietly about some very specific and unremarkable things. A stone jug, sitting near but not too near the fire. Inside the jug is water, which was cold when it was fetched from the well this morning, but has warmed slightly in the warmth of the room. The jug is rough textured on the outside, the clay not quite smooth, with marks left by the hands that shaped it. It has a small crack near the base that has been repaired with clay, and which holds well enough. It has been used for many years. It will be used for more years still, probably. A pile of fleece waiting to be carded sitting in a basket near the loom. The fleece is the natural greyish-white colour of the sheep it came from. It is soft and slightly waxy with the last traces of lanolin that washing did not remove. When you press your hand into it, it gives gently and springs back when you lift your hand away. It smells faintly of wool. A door, made of planks of wood fitted together and hung on leather hinges. The fit of the door is not perfectly tight, and in a high wind you can feel cold air entering round its edges. A piece of heavy cloth has been hung over the door on the inside, which helps with this. When someone opens the door to go out, the cold air comes in with them, and the room temperature drops briefly before the door is closed again and the fire slowly warms it back up. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sitting near the fire doing nothing in particular. Their cheeks are flushed with the heat. They are looking into the fire, watching the flames. There is nothing particular in their expression. They are simply there, near the warmth, not thinking about anything specific, content in the uncomplicated way of a child who is warm and not hungry and not required to do anything at this particular moment. These are the details of winter. This is what it looked like from the inside. Let us now drift further into the quiet of it. The days pass one after another in deep winter, and they are similar to each other. They have the shape of the tasks that must be done, and the long middles where time moves slowly. Someone remarked, in some piece of writing from some ancient culture, on the length of winter days. Not the daylight hours, which are short, but the felt length of the indoor time, the stretching of hours when there is nothing urgent to do, and you have already done the non-urgent work available to you, and you are simply waiting. Waiting is what winter asked of people ultimately. You could not plant, you could not harvest, you could not move easily, you could not do the work of the warmer months. You were waiting for the world to be ready again. This waiting was filled with small occupations, as we have described, but it was still waiting. The fire burned, the days went by. The food stores diminished slowly, which you monitored with some care. The days began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen again after the solstice. Ancient peoples noted the solstice because they were watching. Days that were shortening had been shortening since midsummer, and each successive day was slightly shorter than the last. A change too small to perceive on any given day, but clearly visible across the weeks. And then, somewhere around the solstice, the shortening stopped. The days began to lengthen. This was the first signal that winter, for all its remaining weeks and months, had turned a corner. This is why the winter solstice was significant. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. The sun reached its lowest arc across the sky, turned around, and began its way back. This was not visible to the naked eye on a single day. You needed to watch for days before and after the solstice to perceive the change in daylight. But people were watching because they had always watched, because it mattered to them. The first perceptible lengthening of the days after the solstice was a comfort. Even with months of cold ahead, the direction had changed. The light was returning, however slowly. This is why the festivals of midwinter, Yule, Saturnalia, the countless others, had their timing where they did. They mark the turning point, and the turning point deserved marking. After the solstice, winter continued. This is important to acknowledge, because the turning point is not the ending. After the solstice, in many northern regions, the coldest months are still ahead. January and February can be colder and harsher than December. The food stores that have lasted through the early winter now have further to last. The animals have been fed for months and the hay stocks have diminished. The cold has not relented. But the light is coming back, and that is something. The hungry gap we mentioned earlier, that period in late winter and early spring when stored food was running low, was a real concern. Communities that had been careful with their stores might still be eating adequately in February and March, if barely. Communities that had been less careful, or that had suffered some setback, a disease among the animals, a barn fire, a flooding of the storage pit, might be in real difficulty. People helped each other where they could, because they all understood the vulnerability, having all lived through it themselves. Wild foods that appeared in early spring were watched for with some eagerness. The first green things, nettles, wild garlic, certain early growing plants, were gathered and eaten as soon as they appeared, not just for food, but for the particular pleasure of something fresh and green after months of stored provisions. The vitamin content of fresh greens after a winter of preserved food was genuinely valuable, even if ancient people did not have a concept of vitamins. They could feel the difference in their bodies, the improved energy, the taste. This is the direction winter moves in, toward spring, toward green things, toward longer days. The movement is slow and sometimes feels like it has stalled, but it continues, and eventually definitively spring arrives. The ground softens, the first birds return, the ewes have their lambs, the seeds are brought out and the fields are prepared. Winter is over until next year. And now perhaps you are warm. Perhaps you have adjusted your pillow. Perhaps the room around you is quiet and the light is low, and the sounds outside your window are the ordinary sounds of the night in the place where you live. You are not cold. You are not hungry. You do not need to get up and check on the animals or break ice from the water trough or rebuild the fire from coals. You have simply been listening to a very long and quiet account of something that happened for thousands and thousands of years in various forms, in various places, to people who lived and worked and slept and woke and managed the cold and waited for spring. They all waited for spring, and spring always came. Rest now. The fire is fine. The stores are adequate. The animals are settled. The hay will last. The days are already, very slightly, getting longer. Everything that needed to be done today has been done, or will keep until tomorrow, and tomorrow the tasks will be the same tasks, done in much the same way, and that is not a problem. That is simply winter. That is how it was. Good night. A continuation, because there is more to say. If you are still awake, that is entirely fine. There is more to say. There is always more to say about winter, because winter was long and it happened every year, and the people who lived through it had a great deal of time to think and work and simply exist in the particular way that winter demands. Let us talk for a while about the tools that people used in ancient winters. A tool is a simple thing. It is an extension of the hand, shaped to do work more efficiently than the hand alone can do it. The tools of ancient winters were made from materials available in the world around their makers: stone, bone, wood, horn, and eventually metal. Each material had its properties. Stone could be knapped into sharp edges but was brittle. Bone was tough and could be polished smooth. Wood was light and workable but rotted in damp conditions. Horn could be shaped by heating. Metal, copper, bronze, iron in succession across the centuries could be cast and hammered and filed into shapes impossible in other materials and held an edge better than stone. The tools of the indoor winter workshop were modest. A knife was perhaps the most universally important tool for shaping wood, cutting meat, trimming leather, and 100 other small tasks. Awls of bone or metal were used for punching holes in leather. Needles, already mentioned, were used for sewing. Small chisels and gouges were used in woodwork. Scrapers were used for preparing hides. Preparing hides, turning the raw skin of a slaughtered animal into usable leather, was a winter task in many cultures. The process involved scraping away fat and flesh from the inner surface of the hide, soaking it in various solutions to loosen the hair and begin the tanning process, working it to keep it supple as it dried. Tanning agents varied by culture and region. Oak bark was widely used in Europe, producing what is called vegetable tanned leather. The result, after considerable effort over days or weeks, was a durable, flexible material that could be sewn into shoes, bags, harness parts, clothing, containers, and much else. Leatherworking was a skilled winter occupation. The person who was good at it could produce items of real quality and durability. The cobbler, the leather worker, specifically focused on footwear, was someone whose skills were valuable in winter, when feet needed the best possible protection from cold and damp. The mending of leather was also a winter task. Leather goods wore out, straps cracked, soles wore thin. The stitching of a leather shoe, done with an awl and thick thread of sinew or waxed plant fibre, came undone over time and needed to be redone. These repairs were done in winter, when time was available, so that the items were ready when needed in the busier seasons. Woodworking in winter was quieter and more reflective than the outdoor woodwork of warmer months. The lathe, where it existed, a device for spinning a piece of wood rapidly so that a tool pressed against it would cut a smooth, symmetrical form, could be used indoors. Bowls and cups and handles could be turned on a lathe or carved by hand. The carving of wooden spoons was a familiar winter occupation in many cultures, producing objects that were used daily and wore out over time and therefore always needed replacing. A carved wooden spoon is not a dramatic object. It is a functional object. You hold it in your hand and it is smooth from use, warm from being near the fire, slightly worn at the bowl end from years of stirring and serving. It fits the hand. It has a particular weight. It is simply a spoon made in winter, used through the year, eventually replaced by another spoon made in the next winter. This is the texture of ancient material life. Let us now talk about the community aspects of winter, because people did not endure winter even if they could help it. Human beings are social animals, and the social aspects of winter in ancient times were important in practical as well as emotional ways. Communities that helped each other through winter survived better than those whose members competed, sharing resources, food in times of scarcity, labour for large tasks, warmth in the most extreme cold, was a survival strategy as much as a cultural value, and the cultural values that promoted sharing had their roots in the hard practical realities of life in difficult seasons. Community winter tasks were things that benefited from many hands. The threshing of grain, which is hard physical work, went faster with more people doing it. The building or repair of a community structure, a shared grain store, a meeting place, a defensive wall, was better done with collective labour than alone. The care of large herds of animals, particularly when those herds were moved between winter and summer pastures, required multiple people working together. In many ancient cultures, there were buildings or spaces that served a communal function in winter. The mead hall of Germanic and Norse cultures was a large central building where the community gathered, especially in winter, for meals and celebrations and the conduct of social business. It was warm, centrally heated by a large hearth, and well supplied, and it represented the resources of the community's leadership being shared in a way that bound people together. To be invited into the mead hall in winter was to be part of the community. To be excluded was to be on the outside, in the cold. The shared meal was a fundamental social act. Eating together from common stores reinforced the bonds between people and expressed a commitment to collective survival. Even in households, the family meal was not just nutrition. It was a daily reaffirmation of togetherness in the difficult season. The preparation of a meal for others and the eating of a meal prepared by others were acts with social meaning that layered on top of their practical purpose. Hospitality in winter had a moral weight that is hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. To turn away a traveller or a stranger in winter was, in many ancient cultures, a serious moral failing. The consequences of being caught outside in severe cold without shelter were potentially fatal, and everyone knew this because everyone had experienced enough winter to understand what cold could do. So the obligation to provide shelter and warmth to those who needed it was deeply felt and widely maintained. It was also reciprocal. The host who sheltered a traveller might themselves need shelter on another day, and the culture of hospitality that made shelter available was in everyone's interest. Travellers in winter moved carefully and with awareness of the distances between shelter. To be caught between settlements in worsening weather was a real danger, and experienced travellers in cold climates knew to read the sky for signs of incoming storms and to know where they could find shelter along their routes. The planning of winter travel was more deliberate and cautious than summer travel, with more attention paid to contingencies. Let us now think about children in winter once more, because children experienced winter differently from adults, and it is worth dwelling on. For children, winter had a quality of enforced closeness that could be both comforting and confining. You were always inside, or if outside, closely supervised and not far from warmth. The indoor space of your home was your world for these months, and you knew it intimately. Every corner, every crack in the wall, every stone around the hearth. You knew which part of the floor was warmest. You knew where to sit to be out of the draught from the door. You knew the sounds the house made in wind. Children in ancient winters were not bored in the modern sense because they did not have the expectation of constant stimulation that modern children have. They occupied themselves with what was available. They played games with simple objects. They listened to the adults talk. They watched the work being done and gradually participated in it. They napped when tired, without the sense that napping was wasted time. The stories told in winter evenings were particularly meaningful to children because children are the primary audience for stories told for both entertainment and education. The myths and legends and folk tales of ancient cultures were winter stories, passed from older to younger around the fire year after year. A child who listened to these stories absorbed not just the entertainment, but the values and the cosmology they carried. The understanding of what the world was, how it worked, what mattered, how to behave. A grandmother sitting near the fire, spinning, telling a story to the children gathered around her. This is perhaps one of the most enduring images of ancient winter. It happened across cultures and centuries, in round houses and long houses and tents and cave dwellings and mud brick homes. The specific story changed, the specific language changed, but the act, the elder passing knowledge and story to the young in the warmth and stillness of a winter evening, was essentially the same. This is how culture survived. Not through writing for most of human history, but through voices in winter, repeated, remembered, and repeated again. Now let us be very specific about grain storage once more, because grain storage deserves more attention. The storage of grain was perhaps the single most important act of winter preparation in agricultural societies. Grain, whether wheat, barley, rye, millet, rice, maize, or any of the other staple grains cultivated in different parts of the world, was the caloric foundation of most ancient diets. It was calorie-dense, storable, and could be prepared in many ways. Losing a significant portion of stored grain to spoilage, pests, or accident was a serious problem. Grain storage pits were used across many cultures. These were holes dug in the ground, sometimes lined with clay or plaster to prevent moisture infiltration, sometimes unlined. A sealed pit filled with grain could preserve grain quite well, because the grain itself consumed the oxygen in the sealed space, creating conditions unfavourable to many spoilage organisms. When the pit was opened and grain was removed, it needed to be used relatively quickly before the remaining grain was exposed too long to open air. Above-ground storage in granaries, dedicated buildings or rooms for storing grain, was also widely practiced. A good granary kept grain dry, prevented pest access, and allowed ventilation to prevent moisture accumulation. The elevation of grain off the ground on platforms or in raised structures helped protect against ground moisture and rodents. Some ancient granaries were raised on posts or staddle stones, leaving a gap between the floor of the granary and the ground that made it harder for rodents to climb in. The monitoring of stored grain was a regular winter task. Someone checked the grain periodically for signs of problems, moisture condensation, mold, the presence of insect pests, the telltale signs of rodent intrusion. Problems caught early could sometimes be managed. Grain that had begun to go bad could be used immediately before it deteriorated further. The smell of stored grain was one indicator of its condition. Dry, well-stored grain has a clean, slightly sweet smell. Damp or beginning to mold grain smells different, stale and musty, and an experienced person could detect the difference. The measuring of grain was also important. Knowing how much grain was left and estimating how long it needed to last was part of winter management. Various measuring vessels were used, calibrated by custom, if not by precise standard, and the grain store was assessed periodically. If it appeared that supplies would fall short, adjustments could be made, eating slightly less per day, obtaining grain from somewhere else through trade or borrowing, supplementing with other foods. These calculations were the quiet financial planning of ancient winter. Let us think about the particular quality of time in winter. Time in winter felt different from time in other seasons, and this was not merely subjective. The structure of the day was different. The rhythm of work and rest was different. The amount of light available was different. All of these things changed how time felt as it passed. In summer, daylight hours are long, outdoor work is extensive, and the day feels full and active and sometimes inadequate for everything that needs doing. There is a sense of time being used, of tasks being accomplished, of progress being made. The summer day is productive in a way that is satisfying and also exhausting. In winter, the short daylight hours and the limited scope of possible outdoor work created a different rhythm. The day had a slower pulse. The tasks were smaller or less numerous. The evenings were very long. Time that in summer would have been filled with work was in winter available for other things. This change in the texture of time was experienced differently by different people and at different moments. Sometimes the slowness was restful, a needed recovery from the busy seasons. Sometimes it became heavy, the days too similar, the indoor space too small, the time too long. Ancient peoples understood this quality of winter and had various responses to it. The festivals were one response, imposing a structure of celebration and sociality on the undifferentiated winter days. The craftwork was another, giving the idle hands something to do that was both useful and absorbing. The telling of stories was another, filling the long evenings with something that engaged the mind and the emotions. The question of what to do with winter time was, in some sense, one of the questions that shaped ancient culture. The answers that different cultures arrived at, the specific crafts, the specific festivals, the specific stories, tell us something about those cultures' values and priorities and ways of being in the world. Winter, with its enforced indoor time, was in some ways the season most productive of culture, because culture is what people make when they have time on their hands and other people around them. We have now covered quite a lot of ground, or quite a lot of snow as it were. We have talked about grain storage and firewood and wool and bread and animals and ice and snow and children and tools and sleep and stories and the solstice and spring. We have moved through the days of ancient winters slowly and with some attention to the unremarkable details that made those days what they were. And perhaps, as we have moved through these details, you have felt some of what ancient winter felt like. The closeness of the fire, the sameness of the days, the satisfaction of small tasks completed, the warmth of other bodies nearby, the long quiet evenings, the gradual return of light. Perhaps not. Perhaps you have simply listened to words and felt them wash over you like water, like the sound of someone speaking at the next room, and that is fine too. The point is to rest. The point is to let the small details of other people's lives, people who lived long ago and dealt with winter in the only ways they knew, which were practical and careful and communal and unhurried, fill the space of your mind until there is not much room left for the things that keep you awake, because those ancient winters are done. They are over. Every one of them ended eventually in spring. The people who lived through them had the same fundamental experience you have, the need for warmth, for food, for rest, for company, and they managed, and their descendants managed, and here you are, descended in some way from people who endured and survived and found ways to fill the winter evenings until the days grew long again. The fire is fine, the stores are adequate, the days are getting longer. Sleep. One final addition for those still listening. There is something that has not yet been said about winter, and it is this. Ancient people were not miserable in winter. This may seem like an odd thing to clarify, but it is worth clarifying, because when we list the difficulties of ancient winters, the cold, the limited food, the darkness, the illness, the hard physical work, it can sound as though winter was simply a period of suffering to be endured. It was not only that. Winter was also a season of specific pleasures. The pleasure of warmth when you have been cold, coming inside from outdoor work and feeling the fire reach you, is a pleasure that is sharper and more satisfying than warmth maintained at all times. The pleasure of a filling meal after a day of physical work is a pleasure that is diminished by abundance and enhanced by scarcity. The pleasure of lying down to sleep when you're genuinely tired and feeling your body settle into rest is a pleasure that does not require a comfortable mattress or a particular temperature, only actual tiredness and the chance to stop. These pleasures were available to ancient people in winter. They were ordinary pleasures, unremarkable in themselves, but they were real, and they added up to a life that was experienced from the inside, with all the texture and feeling that life has when you are living it rather than observing it from outside. There was also the pleasure of company. Winter, for all its confinement, gathered people together. The need for shared warmth, the shared work, the shared evenings. These created a closeness that is harder to achieve when people are scattered across the fields in summer doing individual work. The winter fire was a gathering point. Around it, people were together in a way that the busier seasons did not always permit. And there was the pleasure of the story. We have mentioned this, but it deserves a final word. The story told by firelight in winter, whether a myth, a folk tale, a personal account of something that happened, a description of a journey or an event, was one of the most purely pleasurable things available in ancient winters, and it cost nothing except the willingness to listen and the ability to tell. It passed the time. It connected people to each other and to their shared past. It made the long evening shorter and the fire warmer. You are, in a way, receiving a version of that right now. A story told in the evening, in the warmth, about people who are no longer here but who were here once, and who sat near fires and mended things and ate their preserved meat and waited for spring, and loved each other in the practical, unsentimental, necessary way of people who depend on each other for survival. They are gone. Their winters are over. The grain they stored has long since been eaten or rotted away. The fires they tended have been cold for thousands of years. The children who sat near those fires and listened to stories grew old and told their own stories, and their own fires went cold in their turn. But winter comes again, every year, and people gather near warmth and the long. Evenings come, and somewhere someone is telling a story in a quiet voice to someone who is trying to sleep. That is still happening. It has always been happening. Rest now. You have heard enough about ancient winters to know that they were managed one day at a time, one task at a time, one fire at a time. You can manage yours the same way. The light is coming back. It always does. Good night. A very brief postscript on the subject of snow. Snow is worth one final mention, because snow has a quality that is relevant here. When snow falls thickly, it muffles sound. The world becomes quieter than it usually is. The ordinary ambient sounds of wind and movement and distant activity are absorbed by the snow, and what remains is a kind of softened quiet that is different from silence but close to it. People in ancient times knew this snow quiet. They would step outside on a heavy snowfall night, and the world would be hushed and still and white, and the sound of their own breathing would be very clear because everything else was muted. The flakes would fall without sound. The sky above would be a pale grey from the reflected light of the snow below. Ancient children, when they went outside into fresh snow, did what children still do. They looked at their footprints, the clear marks they left behind, each step pressed neatly into white. The snow recorded where they had been. It showed that they had passed through, that they were present in this particular place, at this particular moment. In the morning, after a night of snow, you could read the animal tracks around the house, the small paired prints of mice, the larger prints of the dog, the cloven marks of deer that had come close in the night, seeking whatever food they could find near human habitation. These tracks lasted until the next snowfall covered them, or until the thaw made them soft and indistinct. Then the slate was clean again, and new tracks began. This is what winter looked like, seen from above. A white surface, slowly filling with tracks, then covered over, then filling again, round and round through all the days of winter. And the fire inside the whole time was warm, and the people inside were managing, and the light was very slowly coming back. This is where we leave it. In the middle of an ancient winter, with someone tending a fire, and someone sleeping nearby, and the snow outside doing what snow does, which is fall quietly and cover everything in a layer of quiet white, and the world being still, and the night being long, and everything, for now, being fine. Sleep well. You have earned it just by being here. Just by existing in a world that still has winters and still has warmth and still has the long evenings and the particular pleasure of being somewhere quiet when everything outside is cold. The ancient people who stored their grain and mended their shoes and told their stories in the winter evenings would understand this completely. They would recognize you in this moment, because you are doing what they did, resting in the warmth, in the middle of the cold, waiting quietly for morning. That is enough. That has always been enough. Rest now. The fire is fine, and the hay in the barn will last. It has always lasted. It will last again this year, just as it lasted the year before, and the year before that, going back further than anyone can quite remember, back through all the winters that have ever been, all the quiet and the cold and the fire and the waiting and the gradual return of the light, back through all of it, all the way back to the very first fire that someone tended in winter, in a cave or a hut or a hollow in the earth, a long time ago when winter was newer and stranger and harder, but still, in the end, manageable. They managed, and so do we, and so will you. Good night. The embers are glowing, the blanket is heavy and warm. The wind outside, if there is wind, is just wind. It is not dangerous. It is just winter being winter, which is what it has always been. And you are inside. And that is the only thing that matters right now. Being inside, being warm, being quiet, letting the story settle around you like snow, like the soft weight of something gentle coming to rest, like sleep.